This is the Sexy Walt's worm, a fly that probably doesn't even need an introduction. This fly has become a fixture in many anglers' fly box, and for good reason. This variation on the original Walt's worm is a fish-catching machine. Something about the combination of materials and colors just seems to draw fish to this fly. And while the Sexy Walt's is a variation on the original Walt's worm, you'll also see many variations of this variation. Everyone seems to tie it a little differently, myself included. I've worked over the years to try and develop a more durable version of this fly because it winds up in a trout's mouth so frequently. While I tie this in sizes from 20 up to 16 with appropriately sized beads, this variation with a smaller size 18 hook and oversized 3mm bead seems to be my most effective. I think that the shorter, slimmer body better represents many of the small insects trout feed on, and the oversized bead helps it get down to fish quickly. To get started tying this fly, we've got our size 18 hook and our 3mm bead in the vise. We'll go ahead and attach our 60-knot thread. We're going to build up a little bit of a thread dam, keep that bead in place while we tie the fly. Then we'll wrap back to about the halfway point on the hook shank. We're going to add our Mono 0.004. That's the same size as 7X Tippet if you wanted to use that instead. And we're going to take a piece of the Mono that's about 6 to 8 inches long, fold it in half, and just catch it in by the tips. Then we're going to add our tinsel. I like to use this tinsel that I buy at the craft stores during the holidays, usually used for decorating Christmas trees. It's got some real nice color depending upon what's wrapped underneath it and the way the light hits it. Sometimes it's purple, blue, green, red. Really nice coloring, and you can buy a whole lot of it for not much money at all. We'll take a little piece of the tinsel and catch that in on the top of the hook shank. Then we're going to continue to wrap back down the hook shank, a little past where the barb would be. So we're going to be a few wraps into the bend here. And then we'll get ready to dub the fly. Just going to gather up the Mono and the tinsel here, put that in my material clip to keep it out of the way. Then I'm going to rotate the vise so that the thread hangs directly down. I have better access to the thread. And then I will apply some dubbing wax to about 3 inches of that thread. I'm going to go ahead and zoom the camera out here so you get a little bit better look at what I'm doing. Just going to take a little pinch of the dubbing. I'm going to pull some fibers out of that and just stick them to the wax all the way down that section that we put the dubbing wax on. I realize some of this is off camera, but we're just pulling out a few little fibers, sticking them to the wax. Just want to keep this fairly sparse. Don't want to add too much bulk on this small fly. Now I'll grab my bobbin, hold that thread taut, wet my fingers. I'm going to start to just gently twist that dubbing around the thread from the top down to the bottom. When I get to the bottom, I'll wet my fingers again and start working my way back up to the top with a little bit more pressure. Just winding this into a tighter and tighter little dubbing noodle. I'll just continue to work up and down the noodle until I'm happy with it. So I'm pretty happy with the dubbing noodle now. We're going to start to wrap the dubbing up the body of the fly. First couple of turns, we're going to take and just make sure that we've got the dubbing on the hook. And then I'm going to make sure that that dubbing noodle is nice and tight. Just twist that up a little bit more. We'll zoom the camera back in now. We're just going to continue to wrap this dubbing right up the hook shank. After every 2 or 3 turns, I'm going to tighten up that dubbing noodle again. Just want to keep that real nice and slim. Once we get to about the halfway point, we need to start adding a taper. And so using this thin dubbing noodle, we can just go back over sections that we've previously wrapped to add more bulk and build up that taper, instead of taking just one big fat turn. As I get closer and closer to the bead, I like to really thin that noodle out so I can take multiple thin wraps instead of just 1 or 2 big fat wraps. Once we get to the bead, take a few turns, grab the whip finish tool, and we'll come in here and do a 2-turn whip finish so that we can move the bobbin cradle around and park the thread and get it out of the way while we get ready to wrap the tinsel. We're going to counter wrap the tinsel. You can see that the body of the fly looks a little bit thick right now, but as we wrap this tinsel, counter wrapping, so the opposite direction that we were wrapping everything previously, it's going to thin that body out as the tinsel presses into the dubbing. So probably only going to get about 3 or 4 wraps of the tinsel. Once we get up to the bead, take our thread off the bobbin cradle. Just going to catch that tinsel in. And we can go ahead and clip off the rest. Grab the whip finish tool. We're going to do another 2-turn whip finish here. Bring that bobbin cradle around and park the thread one more time. Lots of people use Tippet or Mono on the Sexy Waltz to make it a little more durable and protect that delicate tinsel. I do it a little bit differently. Remember, we had that one piece folded over. So now we need to find the other end, which is going to be a loop. Use some plunger style hackle pliers and grab onto the end of that loop. And then we're going to just twist this mono in a counterclockwise direction until it's twisted up very tight. And I do it this way using the thinner mono instead of something thicker like 5X Tippet for a couple of reasons. One is because now I've got 2 strands. So if one breaks, I've still got one holding the fly together. And it also gives me a little more reflection or refraction when the light hits these twists and gives the fly a little something extra. So once that's twisted up, we're going to go ahead and wrap that over the tinsel. Same direction that we were wrapping the thread. And just try and get your wraps right over the tinsel to protect that tinsel. When I get up to the bead, I'll take a couple of wraps. I'm going to take my thread off the bobbin cradle. I'm going to wrap that mono around the thread a couple of times and just hold the mono tight. Pull that thread up into the collar. Take a couple of turns, and now we've got that mono caught in. It's not going to come untwisted or unwrapped. And we can go ahead and clip that mono off. And now, because we use the hackle pliers, our thread is ready to go for our next fly. I don't use UV resin on the collar of this fly. I think that the resin soaks through all the layers of the fluorescent orange thread and dulls the color of it. And I really don't want that to be dull. I want it to be that nice bright orange. So I'm going to take just a little bit of super glue and put that on about 1.5 inches of the thread, maybe 2 inches. Grab the whip finish tool, and right where those threads cross each other, I'm going to work that thread back and forth, spreading out those little droplets of super glue, working it into the thread. Then I'll do a 3 or 4 turn whip finish, finishing right up there at the bead. And we can clip our thread off. Some people like very spiky waltz worms, and if that's the way you like your waltz is very spiky, then you can be done here. Personally, I don't like them very spiky. I like to trim them down, so I'm going to go ahead and trim those fibers down a little bit. So there you go. Sexy waltz worm. At least that's the way that I like to tie it. It's definitely not the best looking fly in the vise, but in the water it does a fantastic job of catching fish. I've got a couple of sexy waltz here in my vise to illustrate a point. This one here on the left has already been in the water and is wet. This one here on the right is still dry. As I mentioned in the video, the sexy waltz isn't necessarily the best looking fly in the vise, but it looks very different once it gets wet. Despite having used the natural materials, which appeared gray and brown while we were dubbing the fly, you can see that that dubbing takes on an almost kind of olive color. And the Christmas tinsel, when wrapped over that darker underbody, takes on a bluish green hue versus the more silvery look on the dry fly. So I wouldn't worry too much about trying to make your sexy waltz look great in the vise, because once it gets in the water, it becomes something altogether different.